Welcome to Brotherhood Mutual's webinar, Church Security, Insurance and Law. Thank you for joining us today. If you're experiencing audio issues, please check to make sure the volume on your computer speakers is turned up. The information provided in this webinar is intended to be helpful, but it does not constitute legal advice and is not a substitute for advice from a licensed attorney in your area. A couple of notes specific to church security. First, call your attorney before starting your security program. In some states and communities, anything labeled security is regulated. Your church attorney should be able to tell you what rules and regulations apply to your ministry. Second, be sure to call your insurance agent. Ask him or her about the impact forming a security and safety team could have on your insurance. Today's webinar is being recorded. We will post the file on our website and send you an email when it's available for download. Our presenter today is Kay Landwehr, Associate Attorney at Brotherhood Mutual. Since joining the company in 2011, she's assisted ministries with risk management, specializing in the areas of child protection, employment law, workers' compensation, and safety and security. Landwehr received her Juris Doctorate from the Indiana University School of Law, Indianapolis, and is licensed by the Indiana Supreme Court. Prior to joining Brotherhood Mutual, she served as a private practice, criminal defense, and family law attorney. Mike Kramer will also serve on our panel today. He's a casualty claims adjuster too at Brotherhood Mutual Insurance Company. He's investigated and negotiated thousands of bodily injury, automobile, and property damage liability claims, applying insurance policies and applicable legal concepts. Kramer's a graduate of Indiana University and holds the Associate in Claims, Associate in Insurance Services, and the Certified Insurance Services Rep designations. His experience and background in teaching, service, and claims gives him unique perspective assisting churches and church-related ministries. Now I'll turn it over to our presenter, Kay Landwehr.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for listening as we discuss safety and security. As important as that topic is, I know that it can be somewhat daunting to dive into safety and security and the way that we can develop a safety and security team and how we can go about modifying our current safety and security program. And that concern is not increased at all by the fact that you're seeing that you're going to hear about safety and security from an attorney. I'm going to promise that it's not going to be that bad today, folks. We are going to hit the mile-high view on safety and security. We're not going to get into the weeds or too much legalese. This is really just going to give you some general guidelines and general principles to help you either develop your program or modify your current program. And as soon as I said that, you're concerned because the first slide that you see that I've posted here is a legal disclaimer. I assure you that that's not a concern for things to come. It's mainly just to let you know what I just said a moment ago, that today we are just doing general principles and general guidance, and there's not going to be legal advice or too much legalese to be concerned with. Security at church, well, that's not a novel concept anymore, is it? And the fact that you're listening and viewing this webinar indicates that you know this isn't a novel concept. There has been recent incidents, shootings, and other violence disturbances at churches that are getting you thinking about safety and security, whether you're developing a program or really taking a good hard look at your current policies and procedures to see if you need to do any modifications. These are a list of some of the more often seen safety and security concerns, and some of them you're going to see more often and others you're going to see less frequent, but whether you're dealing with a medical emergency, weather emergency, or a violent incident, there are safety and security concerns that you need to keep in mind, and having those policies and procedures ahead of time will help you respond instead of react in those situations. So as we go through this today, there's going to be a few things that we're going to keep in mind. First, we're going to look at duty and what we owe our people that we're inviting into our premises and our participants. We're also going to look to see if there's any legal requirements when you're developing your security program. We'll discuss concealed carry, and then we're going to distinguish policies and procedures. They're too often used together, but as you're really looking at these policies and procedures as a whole, distinguishing the two independently will be helpful. First, let's look at duty. All right, when you invite individuals into your premises, you have the general duty, and that's going to be to protect against an unreasonable risk of harm, and then to provide first aid to the ill and injured until professionals can arrive to care for those. However, that's just our general level of duty, and there are instances where that general level of duty is going to be increased, and we need to be aware of that higher level of duty situations. There's a couple that we can keep in mind. One is a special relationship where, well, when's that going to be? When are we going to have a special relationship that's going to increase that duty? A good way to think of that is our children's ministry. And I said I wasn't going to do any legalese, but here's just a little bit. In loco parentis. Oh, what's that? It sounds like a lot of Latin gobbledygook. It's in place of the parent. And as any parent out there knows, that's not going to be just that general level of duty. If you're going to act in place of the parent, you're going to act as a reasonable parent would in those same or similar circumstances, and that's certainly going to be an increased level of duty. All right, voluntary assumption of duty. Well, when's that going to come into play? That's going to be any time that ministry leadership makes a decision to assume a higher level of duty. And a good example of that are the lockdown situation. If for whatever reason, because of a threat that ministry leadership is aware of, or because of an emergency type situation due to weather or other concerns, if ministry has decided that we're going to go on lockdown, you have now eliminated those individuals that are present opinion and choice to leave the premises at will. You've taken away that decision and placed it within yourself. So therefore, you have a higher level of duty to make the right decisions for those individuals. Okay, let's do some hypotheticals, because hypos are a little easier way to kind of conceptualize some of these without getting too legalese on you. Okay, it's a typical Sunday morning. People are coming and going throughout the building. A mentally unstable man enters the building, hitting and knocking over individuals, injuring several of them as he enters. The man was at the church previously, and members of the security team escorted him out of the building then. So what's the liability in this case? Well, let's remember duty. What would be our duty in this situation? If you're going to have that general level of duty, that's to protect against an unreasonable risk of harm. Who decides what's reasonable? And what would be reasonable in this situation? Well, first of all, the person that's going to decide who's reasonable is the person sitting next to you, the people that you know, your friends, your neighbors, others that are members in your congregation. Because what it comes down to, after an incident has happened, if this happens to go to trial, the people that determine reasonableness is a jury, and that's your peers. So what you have to ask yourself when a situation is posed like this hypothetical is, what would your neighbors do? What would your friends do? What would your family members do? And would they consider the way that ministry leaders acted in this situation reasonable? Well, let's think about the hypothetical again. We have a situation where an unstable individual enters and injures several people. Well, that can't be predicted, but maybe in this situation it could have. This individual was at the premises previously and was escorted from the building at that time. So did ministry leadership have noticed that this individual might be a threat to others? So in that case, would it have been reasonable to escort this individual from the premises before any injuries could have occurred? Okay, let's do another one. This is going to be in the children's education realm. A non-custodial parent asks a nursery worker to release his child to him after Sunday services. Nursery workers know of a restraining order limiting the non-custodial parent's contact with the child and refuses to release the child to that parent. The non-custodial parent becomes irate in this situation. Nursery workers call church security to escort this man from the premises. What's our liability? Well, I'm going to ask another question. Could we be sued? Those are two very different questions. Whether or not you're going to have liability is going to come back to our duty conversation, and we'll get there in a minute. Whether or not you can be sued is if anyone could ever bring a claim. Well, unfortunately, speaking as an attorney, I can tell you that's likely always going to be yes. You can find an attorney that's willing to file a claim or file a lawsuit on almost anything. But what you have to ask yourself is, which lawsuit do you want to defend? Do you want to defend a lawsuit where someone is upset and irritated because they were treated unfairly in their eyes? Or do you want to defend a lawsuit where perhaps a child was released to someone that might cause them harm? So let's think about our legal implications. Back to duty. Special relationship. This is going to be that higher level of duty, folks, because this is the nursery and these are children, and we have assumed that higher level of duty to act in place of the parents. And no reasonable parent would release a child to someone that they know is not to have them. So in this situation, there probably wouldn't be any type of a liability concern, although there could be a lawsuit brought, because the nursery worker was aware of this restraining order because of proper check-in and check-out procedures. That nursery worker had the tools available to them to make that proper decision to say, you're on my list as someone that cannot pick up this child, and because my policy says so, I am not going to allow this child to go with you. At that point, she also had the tools to be able to contact her security team to escort the irate individual from the building. This enabled her to make the right decisions to reasonably protect the child in this situation. Let's do another one. A church hires a guard from a local security firm to work with the unarmed security team members. Church fails to check his qualifications or training and provides no guidance regarding the weapons policy. An estranged husband enters a Bible school class, grabs his wife, holds a knife to her. The guard rushes into the room, pulls his firearm, shoots, and inadvertently kills the wife. What's our liability? I doubt that that was the inevitable goal in that situation, but because of circumstances, perhaps this could have been prevented. So what are we thinking in this situation? Let's go over some of the facts again. You have a situation where security team members contacted a security firm. All right, well, that's going to be an independent contractor, right? Okay. So that should be the end of the story. We've done everything that we need to do. Certainly the security firm checks all of the qualifications and provides the training that's needed for their weapons policy. And because they hired a guard that was intended to be armed and work with the unarmed security team, that was all that was needed. Unfortunately, this was a tragic event, but surely there's no liability here for the church. Unfortunately, that's likely not the case. This could be a situation where there's negligent hiring. Because again, what's our level of duty, and can that be breached? Well, if your duty is to protect against an unreasonable risk of harm, how unreasonable would it be to simply make sure that the security firm has certifications and qualifications for their armed security guards? How difficult would it have been to ask that security firm for that documentation prior to appointing that position for that individual? How hard would it have been to go further and make sure that any training that was needed for this individual was placed before he was allowed to carry at the church in that position, in that authority? Because in that moment, when you have to make a split-second decision, someone in that position must have those training qualifications and certifications to avoid situations like this. This tragic event might have been prevented. Now, you may be saying, yes, I understand all of that, but this was an independent contractor. Surely that was the security firm's duty. Unfortunately, while that will provide some insulation, it's not complete immunity. It is still the ministry's requirement to check that, just that basic level, make sure that there is training, that there's education, that there's certifications to make sure that the person is trained and adequately can use the firearm and knows what to do in those situations. All right, these are labeled non-negotiables because these are the areas that, as you're developing or modifying your program, are really important, because these are the areas that, if something should go wrong, are going to be looked at very closely. Just like we saw in the prior hypothetical, hiring and selection, this is huge. You have to make sure that you've got an appropriate screening process so that you're placing individuals in positions where they have an appropriate skill set. They have to be able to demonstrate that they have that, and the only way that you're going to know whether or not you're appointing person to positions that they have that appropriate skill set is to make sure that your screening process is adequate. You have to do background checks. You have to do reference checks. You have to do interviews. You need to do annual application forms. All of these things will allow you to not only have a clear picture of the applicant, but also be aware of anything that would be in their past history that would pose a threat to others. Another section that you need to be aware of is supervision. Now, this is key in a couple of different areas, not only for our staff, but also to make sure that we are indicating that there's enough staff in all of our areas. This is especially important in our children's ministry, making sure that we are following a 2-adult rule, for example, to ensure that you have an adequate number of staff in each of these areas so that safety is always upheld. But also to make sure that we are using supervision of our staff appropriately, and that's the suspension and termination. Now, that's not listed here because I'm saying that every time there is a concern with your staff or someone makes a mistake, they should be terminated immediately. That's not at all what I'm saying. But what is important is that we're documenting and training appropriately. So after something's happened, you don't have an attorney in a deposition that says you knew this individual did not have the appropriate skills. There was an incident in the past and nothing was done. You want to be able to say, I see that there was a situation in the past, but the individual was retrained, they demonstrated that skill set, and we were confident in their ability to move forward. And that goes nicely with our next area, training. I cannot emphasize training enough. It is huge. You have to be able to know affirmatively that your people can demonstrate a mastery of their skills. They have to know how to handle situations that would arise, whether that's a weather emergency or a medical emergency. If something happens in the middle of a service, that is not the time for your people to demonstrate to you that they know how to respond. This should have been worked through previously. You should go through hypotheticals with your staff, do skits, do role play. It's the cheapest way to train your people. It doesn't cost you a thing to sit and work together as a team and work through possible solutions to problems. What would we do if? And by doing that, you're enabling yourself to have that knowledge that your people would know how to respond in a situation. And then insurance, making sure that you know that you've got the coverages you need to protect your people and the ministry for all of these situations. And this will be discussed a little more in the next session. Concealed carry. This is a big one, guys, and we're going to hit it to make sure that you're aware of not only the rights of the ministry, but also the people that are carrying on your property or that are participating within your ministry. And we hear it all the time. Well, I have a concealed carry permit, so I have a right to carry on your property. This permit allows me to carry anywhere I wish to take it. Unfortunately, that's not what that permit says. It's not a right to carry. It's a conditional license, and that condition is on your permission. You're a private property owner. You have the right to choose who carries on your property. Now, concealed carry laws do vary significantly from state to state. So this is a situation where I am going to encourage consultation with a locally licensed attorney to know where your state stands on things like notice requirements, warning signs, if concealed carry is completely prohibited on your premises, as in some states. But if those types of restrictions are not specifically listed by law, generally speaking, as a private property owner, you can choose not to allow that on your property. Having said that, that's not the only choice that's available. And other choices could be that we want to make sure that we know who's carrying on our property. So how will we put that into place? Simply having a policy that indicates if you're going to carry on the ministry property, you have to have permission of ministry leadership ahead of time. That way, ministry leaders are aware of who's carrying at all times. And on the other spectrum, you can say, well, we don't really have a policy. We're going to permit concealed carry as long as people have their permit, that's fine. So you really have three choices. And that's what this chart is going to demonstrate for you. Those three decisions that you can make. We're either going to have a strict concealed carry, and that's saying only security team members or no one may carry on the property. Moderate, and that's the one that I was describing, that's kind of more middle of the road. That's going to say that you have to have permission first, folks. We want to know if you're carrying on the premises. And then the other is not to have a concealed carry policy at all. I'm not going to tell you today what's going to work best for your ministry. That is a decision that ministry leaders have to have and work through on their own. And it's an important discussion. I'm not going to tell you which to choose, but I am going to tell you to choose one. It's crucial to make sure that you know how your ministry feels about concealed carry and then develop a policy that's going to implement that. Because what's important is that you're going to have pushback no matter what your decision is. If your decision is to strict concealed carry completely, and that's fine if that's what's right for your ministry, but you have to understand that there's going to be participant pushback from that. There's also going to be pushback if if it's by permission only. So working through some of that and understanding not only how the ministry feels, but how they will respond to some of that pushback is important. Policies and procedures. As promised, we're gonna dive into these. They're said always together, aren't they? It's like spaghetti and meatballs. Nobody ever says it separately. Unfortunately, they're not synonyms, and it's important to distinguish what a policy is and what a procedure is, so that as we're developing our programs, we can develop them and then implement them appropriately. So let's start with policy first. That's the who, the what, and the why of your security program. Think of it as the general rule set and your philosophy of your security program. And that's going to be really important. It's the conversation that you have as ministry leadership as you sit down around a table and discuss what are we trying to accomplish here and why. Okay, well, let's say that we're wanting to have a safer children's ministry, so we really need to think about how we're going to have our check-in and check-out policies and procedures, because we really think we need to develop how that's going to happen. Well, why would we want to do that? Well, because children are important to us, and that children's ministry is growing and it's developing, and we want to make sure that we're mentoring and ministering to their minds and their faith walk appropriately, and the only way that we can do that is to ensure their safety. Well, who's going to accomplish that? Well, we need to make sure that that's going to be our youth ministry pastor, and that's going to be our volunteers that work in the nursery, and that's going to be our youth leadership. So that's what we're going to accomplish, and that's by whom, and that's why. Procedure is how. And so while it's clear they're always used together, because clearly one is not going to be very useful without the other, this helps us really distinguish the two. Your procedure is your how, your when, and your where of your security program. Think of it as we established what our rules are, but here's our step-by-step instructions on how we're going to implement those. Your Security for Dummies manual, if you will. But I am going to say this very importantly, and could I have possibly made this section of the slide any larger, and it's because it is so important. Procedures will be the part that is scrutinized most by litigators. It is the part that they will dive into as soon as something has happened. You'll be in a deposition and an attorney will be grueling you on, you had these procedures in place, why were they not followed? And that's because if you have this manual in place and you have all of these policies and procedures developed and no one follows them, they haven't been implemented, it makes you look even more negligent. That's not to say having policies and procedures isn't important. What it is to say is that once you develop them, that goes right back to that, can I hit you over the head anymore with it? You have to train your people. They have to be aware of what these procedures are so that you're able to implement them at the time that you need to. So we know at this point, because I've said it often enough, that we have to develop policies and procedures for our security program. So where do I start? Well, it would be really great if I had a sample. So just Google it. That's all I need to do. Everything you need to find ever is on the internet. I am going to say caution. Having a canned security program is helpful, but that's not what you're looking for. I'm not saying don't go and look for a sample template. In fact, I'm going to point you to some that you can find right on Brotherhood Mutual's website. What I am going to say is that's your starting point. It's not the ending point. You don't want to take a 56-page wonderful policy that someone else has developed for their ministry, place your ministry's name on it, and call it the end, because no one's invested in that. And if you're not invested, you're not going to follow it. Use that as a program to say, oh, these folks are really similar to us. They've developed policies and procedures that seem like they would work for our ministry. Okay, great. Now we need to really dig in and tailor those to our ministry to make sure that it fits our size, our ministries, our philosophy, and to make sure that our people are well trained in those so that we don't have a situation where, as thorough as the developers were in placing this program on a shelf, the people that are actually working day to day were never aware of it. And as much as I loved talking about the legal areas, I understand that I've probably created more questions than answers in this short amount of time that we were able to really delve into this important topic. So I want to make you aware of a really important resource that's available to you. And it doesn't matter if you are a Brotherhood Mutual insured or not. go onto the website and you're able to get to legal assistance. There are a lot of articles and question and answers that are available to you that will be able to help you kind of dive into some of these questions a little further. There's also a guidebook that will help you for many different areas, whether that's working together that'll help you develop an employment handbook, whether that's guidelines for ministry workers that'll help you develop your policies and procedures in your youth ministry, or other areas of your ministry. You'll really be able to see some things that will help you get started, and that's what's important. Use them as a template to get started. If after you read some of the resources you still feel like, this didn't answer my question, there's also a quick response link that you can get right to one of us attorneys, and we'll do everything we can to answer your question and get back to you the same day. Well, unfortunately, sadly for me, we have come to a close on talking about legalese, and don't get too excited though, folks. It's time to talk insurance. And for that wonderful segment, I will pass it on to my colleague, Michael Kramer.
Thank you, Kay. I appreciate all that, and I believe that it's a good segue to go into leading the legal portion of this. Those are going to be the areas where we're trying to avoid whether or not you're going to be asking the question, am I going to get sued over this, or do I have any liability? If you've been able to handle that portion of it, then the insurance part is pretty easy. You've got it already in place. This is something that is already a non-negotiable, and it's included in your ministry. What we'll be looking at today is how your insurance is going to react once we actually have a claim come in and once we actually have a scenario that we'll be dealing with. I don't have a disclaimer slide like Kay had, but I will make a disclaimer statement, and that is I encourage you to go ahead and read your insurance policy. I don't have your insurance policy in front of me. I have read many insurance policies. It is something that, it's going to take a little while to get through. Your attorney may be able to help you. I encourage you to use your insurance agent, an underwriter, and another insurance adjuster at the insurance company that you have, because this insurance policy is a contract. You pay a premium, and there is a promise that there should be some insurance coverage, there'll be some payment in case you encounter a claim. Insurance does not cover every contingency that is out there, so make that aware, or make sure that you're aware of that. It does cover a lot, especially if you have an insurance policy considered an open perils policy, where it's open to coverage unless it's specifically not included or excluded, is what we will. So what we'll walk through is these 4 points on the insurance side of it, and 4 specific pieces, questions that you probably have to ask regarding insurance rather than the legal part of it. Will team members be covered individually for lawsuits caused by a security incident? You're going to be setting up your security team. You just saw that you have policies and procedures that you need to put in place, going out there looking at best practices. Now you have a security team in place, an incident occurs, and you have a claim that arises out of that. Individuals are the ones that make up the security team. If a lawsuit comes in, how will your insurance react? Will an intentional act by a security team member invalidate our coverage? We'll be answering that, and we'll be looking at a sample insurance definition that will help us figure out this intentional act portion. Does our insurance cover an armed security team? As in the last session, that concealed to carry, whether or not we're going to be armed or unarmed is going to be that question that's going to pop forward. That in the legal realm, you're going to have to make a decision on your own. Your insurance company has also most likely made a decision on how they feel they're going to handle claims that involve armed security team members, and in general how insurance coverages deal with that. What special coverages do we need to adequately cover our security team? Not only do we have higher duties and special incidences that we're going to be dealing with, but there is some special coverages that you need to have in place for this special security team that you're going to create. As in the legal portion, I think scenarios and claims, which is what I handle day in and day out, is the best way to illustrate how your insurance policy is going to react. So am I covered for that? Does your insurance policy see this as a covered loss? Will there be some payments out from your insurance company when something similar to this happens? In this case, we have a security team member that uses excessive force during an incident and causes serious bodily injury. The injured person who, in fact, did cause the incident in the sentence before decides that after they caused the incident and had to be subdued by the security team that they're going to sue the church, the team member, and the security director. This is a scenario that I'll get on my desk and I'll take a look at it. The first thing that I look at is the incident itself. I look at whether, how the makeup of this happened, what incident was it, why did the security team need to respond to this, and so on. I then see that the security team reacted, which is intentional that they reacted, that's what they're there to do, and I go and look to see whether or not the intentional acts exclusion or whether or not what the security team did would be considered intentional and not available for coverage. So if we move forward, I've got a couple of definitions on another slide here. The intentional acts exclusion. When you go into your insurance policy, you're going to see a lot of different sections. You'll have the DEC pages, the declarations pages, and that will tell you what your limits of coverage are in each different part. You'll get definitions. There'll be a whole definition section in your insurance policy that will define certain terms that you'll be reading when you get to this section about your general coverages or the conditions of what your insurance is there for. So if we get into the intentional acts definition and we look at the definition of it and the exclusion of it, we read that the insurance company, we do not pay for bodily injury or property damage which is expected by, directed by, or intended by the insured, which is you, or that is the result of an intentional and malicious act of the insured. So if we go back to our scenario, we have a security team member who is intentionally using force, and it can be seen as intentionally causing bodily injury. If that's the case, then the insurance coverage does not cover that incident. We would exclude it. Now, if you continue to that next sentence under the intentional act exclusion, this exclusion, though, does not apply to bodily injury that arises out of the use of reasonable force to protect people or property. So again, our insurance coverage would come into play not because that you did something intentional, but if you read the definition and apply it, it was because the intentional act that you did wouldn't be considered reasonable. Again, insurance is going to be using this a parallel to what your legal definitions are of did you act reasonably, did you satisfy a reasonable person standard, and in this case, in our scenario, did the security team member act reasonably to protect people and property? And if we take our scenario at face value, no, they used excessive force, not reasonable force, which resulted in serious bodily injury, not just a plain bodily injury. So at that point, we would continue on. We do have a suit that we are dealing with here. You are involved. Attorneys will have to get involved here. And you have an individual, not just a team of people that are named in the suit. And whether or not this team member is covered will depend on how the carrier interprets its exclusion and who the policy covers. When you go into your policy for your church, it's going to say the insured is First Baptist Presbyterian Assemblies of God Church on the corner, and that is going to be your named insured. And when you go into the definitions, it's going to say who the insured is. Some of your policies out there are going to state that volunteers or agents and employees are also included in the definition of insured. And if that's the case, then there will be coverage provided to that team member. And then that security director is an individual as well, not just only the insurance policy stating, well, the church was sued, that's our named insured, that's who we will provide coverage for. The team member and the security director are individuals. When we have our definition of insured does not include those, therefore they're out on their own. Some insurance policies will state that they are insureds. A single individual is the team member, the security director. They are insureds with coverage available to them, but it is on a secondary basis. Some insurance policies may require this volunteer team member to seek primary coverage underneath a homeowner's policy, a personal policy. The insurance policy for the church would not deny the claim. They would just stand secondary to their homeowners, their own personal coverage, And if that personal coverage runs out of limits, then the church's insurance policy would kick in. So again, there's different pieces of it. Maybe they're not even covered. You're going to want to go look and read your definition of insured. Or even if they are covered, there's a possibility that it will be on a secondary basis and not necessarily on a primary basis. So again, encouragement on going to read your insurance policy, get into that definition section, get into that exclusions section. Let's look at another scenario. An incident at a church requires a team member to draw her weapon to stop a threatening individual from harming a church staff member. Take sentence 1. It's not an intentional act because she's doing it reasonably to protect person or property. So right there, we don't look at the exclusion of intentional act. We have a covered loss. As a result of this team member drawing her weapon to stop a threatening individual, a young child witnesses the incident and develops an emotional problem as a result of the incident. The parents of the child brings a claim for PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, against the team member and the church. So now we have a claim. We don't have a lawsuit, but we do have a claim, and they're looking for payment as a result of the child having an emotional injury. What is your insurance company, or in general, what's your insurance policy and your insurance company going to do with this? We want to look at one. We'll start out with the armed guard situation, or the armed team member. Most policies, most liability policies, provide coverage for security operations whether or not the church permits the security team member to be armed, unless there's a specific firearm exclusion. Again, we have an open, most likely we have an open perils policy. We're going to cover it all unless we specifically exclude it. So if we take the question of whether or not we're going to provide coverage solely based on somebody being armed or unarmed, unless you have an exclusion that says if your team member is armed or uses a weapon, we don't cover it, then there will be coverage. The decision on whether or not you allow that is more of a legal decision, and that was discussed in the prior section with Kay. Whether or not the intentional acts exclusion applies will depend on the carrier's interpretation of reasonable force. Again, is it reasonable for this individual to draw this weapon that they are allowed to have, or we're not going to exclude because they have it, a reasonable use of force? And then lastly, your liability policy typically covers bodily injury, which may or may not be broad enough to cover emotional injury. There's a lot of categories to what an injury is. A bodily injury is usually to the physical person. The emotional injury is part of that psychological. Personal injury a lot of times deals with the financial aspect of the claim. And so you have these different areas of injuries, and if this child, who according to our claim scenario didn't suffer bodily harm, can they have an emotional injury if they didn't suffer from a bodily injury? The definition, if we go here rather than to the exclusions, we look at, well, what is a bodily injury according to your insurance company? A bodily injury with most insurance companies is going to read this way. It means bodily harm, sickness, or disease sustained by a person and includes care and loss of services. Bodily injury includes death that results from bodily harm, sickness, or disease. And here's where you want to check your definition in your own policy. Bodily injury does not include mental or emotional suffering or injuries, suffering, or distress that does not result from physical injury. There has to be a causation there. For your insurance company to consider this a valid claim, a valid injury claim by the child who witnessed this event, the definition says isn't covered, the emotional portion of his injury is not covered because he didn't suffer from a bodily injury first. There had to be a bodily injury first before you can have an emotional injury. In the scenario here, we have a child that didn't suffer bodily harm that we're aware of, and therefore there wouldn't be coverage on the bodily injury side of this claim because there was none with this child. Definitions, exclusions, conditions, limits of coverage, coordinations of other insurance policies, these are all the things that I deal with, or claims adjusters deal with in these different scenarios that you'll want to be familiar with before you get into a situation. Because as you go through and you look at these coverages, again, there are cases where your insurance company is not denying the claim. They're only indicating that you have either lower limits or small limits, or that there's another insurance policy out there, so you need to seek those limits first before coming to us. And that's going to create some gaps. Again, not a denial of coverage, but there may be some gaps in some coverage. Medical payments is a typical limit that you're going to see on both homeowners policies, auto insurance policies, and then also your church insurance policy. It's a coverage that is limited by its dollar amount, its time amount, and its scope of what it does cover. It's restricted to medical and medically related expenses. This limit, though, isn't going to be like your liability policy limit, which would typically be, maybe $500,000 or $1 million or more, depending on the size of your operation. Your medical payments limit may be, $1,000, $2,000, or $5,000, depending on what you've chosen when you signed up with your insurance company. If we look at a serious bodily injury claim or a typical security response or traumatic incident, and you have to go beyond just the emergency room, but there's surgery required because of this, if a weapon is discharged and you have a gunshot wound, it's going to typically cost you a lot more than just $1,000 or $5,000 because of the scope of the injury. You may have a gap there. And again, your insurance company is not going to deny the claim, but they may only indicate that they can cover so much of it. I'm sorry, we'll only be able to pay up to $5,000 of your medical treatment, despite you having a $25,000 to $30,000 claim. Typically, wage loss is something that's also encountered, and a lot of times your insurance policy not only will cover the wage loss of the injured party, but if we're dealing with a minor, we extend this wage loss to the parents who have to take off time to care for this child as well. But again, this isn't an AFLAC policy. This isn't a long-term or short-term disability policy. This is it's a wage loss policy connected to your church insurance. And typically, again, those coverage limits, we're not denying, we're not saying that you didn't sustain wage loss. It's just that on your policy built into it may only be $1,000 or $2,000 to help pay for wage loss, which for some of us would cover us for quite a bit. But for those, some of you that are out there, $1,000 or $2,000 isn't really going to carry you very far. And you want to make sure that you want to know what those limits are and that there's a potential exposure or gap that you have. Primary coverage, primary and excess, primary or secondary, however you want to compare the two. That is where we looked at that definition of your insured. Who are we going to cover? And then as you go farther into your insurance policy, yes, we cover them, but are we going to cover them on a primary basis, or are we going to cover them on a secondary basis, or even maybe a pro rata where we take percentages or fractions of the cost? Commercial and homeowners characters will fight sometimes, jockey for position on who's going to be primary or secondary, and you want to make sure that you know if you're going to, instead of hiring a team member, you're going to create a team of volunteers, how your policy is going to react if they're named individually or if they're injured themselves. Post-incident counseling, a bodily injury does result in emotional injury many times. Even the witnessing of an event, if you're not harmed bodily, you're going to have an emotional injury that results from that. Typically, you're not going to see any kind of counseling coverage that's available in your insurance policy. It's mostly, again, restricted to that emotional or bodily injury or financial piece of it. And so it's a possibility that you have a gap there. You want to read your policy. Moral versus legal obligation. If we go back to that scenario that you had in the legal portion about a duty that you owe, and you have that moral duty that you owe to an individual, or you're on the fence of whether or not you provided that duty to them morally or legally, your insurance policy doesn't necessarily have that question in their mind of whether or not they have a moral or legal obligation to the claimant. They're strictly going to look at what the insurance policy says they cover. So despite you possibly feeling as if it needs to cover more, or that they need to extend the coverage in this particular area, your insurance coverage covers most legal obligations, but it doesn't always cover what you feel is a moral responsibility by the operations or by your ministry. This could be the case, and basically what you want to find out is that if your insurance company wants to find coverage, in many cases they're going to find it. But if an insurance coverage wants to deny a claim, then there are a lot of opportunities in the policy to make things look as if there isn't insurance coverage. Some insurance policies don't necessarily want to even deal with that. They just go ahead and they cancel your coverage. Information is always power. Knowledge is power. You want to make sure that you make your insurance company aware of how your ministry is being operated. You want to make sure that they're aware of these are the activities that you're going to be in there, so that you know you've got a partner with you that's going to go with you into this law, into this courtroom, into this claim, into this incident that has come upon you through a security matter or a traumatic matter. This is a chart, the same chart that we had, that's be able to show you a comparison. This one's going to look and show you these different areas of possible gaps that you have, again, either created by limits or created by exclusions or created by secondary rather than primary coverages. This is a good chart to go ahead and take a look at as you're looking through your insurance policy. Brotherhood Mutual recognized that because of the gaps that exist out there when claims of traumatic and security-related claims come in, that we needed to respond. And so Brotherhood's created a couple of different endorsements or added coverages onto policies that if you choose to want, you can add to it. If you're not a Brotherhood Mutual insured, then these may be available for you at your insurance company as well. Just ask the question. But because of the gaps created, there is an endorsement that increases the med pay limit for you, so that you're not only dealing with several $1,000s, you'd have a lot more to be able to assist that individual who's injured. Increased wage loss. We recognize about counseling. Many of you have a ministry of counseling those that need assistance through grief. This one is a response to injuries. This would be related and it would be covered. Extra expenses that do arise out of this that have nothing to do with injuries, but you may have to make a public statement, and we want to make sure that that right statement that is directly related to your mission statement and your operations can be made through a public relations assistant, and we would assist in paying in that, or this coverage would. Legal assistance, you have the legal assistance available through Brotherhood, as Kay had mentioned at the end of her piece, but legal assistance in the way that if you want to consult local counsel on how to react or what to do in cases where you have a traumatic incident, and the claim hasn't even been filed, we would be able to help pick up that if you have this endorsement. And then a lot of times, especially if you have an injury that results in property damage as well, we would have some coverage to answer the question, where are we going to meet the incident, or we kind of let things settle, we would be able to provide some insurance coverage to help you get a temporary meeting space. The other one is a policy or an endorsement to your policy that's specific to your security operations, and this again helps fill in the gaps as much as we can. We increase the med pay, we increase the wage loss, we increase the counseling benefit, we make sure that your volunteer team members are going to have primary coverage, they're not going to have to go back to their homeowners. We're going to modify the intentional acts exclusion and make sure that we recognize that all actions taken by a security team, are intentional and are meant to protect person and people and property damage, and so we modify that exclusion because we looked at the common definition prior to this point. And then personal injury and emotional injury coverages, there's certain pieces of this insurance policy that recognize the gaps in that as well, and so it's a good one if you're going to be having a specific security operations in force in your ministry. Passport to ministry is separate from the property and casualty policy that you have. Not only do we, when a claim comes in, we look and see if this is a covered loss, if it happens within the policy period, but we also look to see if it's going to be within the range of where your policy comes into play. Most of your insurance policies, even your health insurance policy, if you look at that, is going to stop at the border, or it's only going to cover Canada and North America, or Canada, the United States, and its territories. We recognize that your ministry is not just going to be domestic, but that you do go and take the word and baptize those out into the rest of the world on other continents and in other countries. And when you do that, your church insurance policy likely doesn't follow you, and those individuals in your operations and in your ministry leaving the country, their health insurance doesn't as well. But that doesn't mean that there are not going to be accidents, there's not going to be sicknesses. Passport to ministry is a great in short-term or even long-term insurance policy that's going to help cover you when you go overseas. And it includes coverages to help pay on medical and sicknesses, medical evacuation, security assistance. A lot of times it includes legal assistance in case an incident happens and you're sued in another country. Just call in. There will be specific insurance reps that will help you out in that passport to ministry area. And again, another plug for Legal Assist here. Kay certainly talked about it. There are several other people here at Brotherhood. Regardless of whether or not you're a Brotherhood Mutual insured, you have access to this. Send in your questions, ask your questions so that we can help you and assist you as you move forward. You know, and not just in your security aspect of your ministry, but in other portions of your ministry as well. Make sure that you take advantage of that. It's extremely good benefit, and I'm proud to be in a company that does provide this for you. Thank you.
All right, thanks Kramer, and thanks to Kay as well. And we're coming up on the end of our scheduled time for the webinar, but before we do finish, we'd like to tell you about the Church Safety and Security Guidebook and DVD Kit, which you can order at brotherhoodmutual.com. If you already have a safety and security team, or if you're just starting one, regardless, it's a must-have resource. The Safety and Security Guidebook, it's a comprehensive resource. It's designed specifically for churches. It contains over 200 pages of material, plus a DVD that'll help you in every phase, including a step-by-step startup guide. It has checklists that help you make sure you've covered all your bases. It has sample policies that can govern the team along the way, and even scenarios that you can use in your team's training sessions. And as a thank you for checking out today's webinar, you'll receive 20% off your order of the Security Guidebook. Just go to the website, brotherhoodmutual.com, and under the Resources tab, click Church Security. Follow the directions from there, and you enter the promo code CSWEB1012. Again, that's CSWEB1012. Enter that promo code at checkout, and you'll get that discount. And that offer is only good through December 31st, 2012. Again, if you have additional questions that were not answered in today's webinar, you may want to utilize our legal assistance service online. Again, the website, brotherhoodmutual.com. It's free regardless of whether your ministry is a Brotherhood Mutual Insurance customer or not. So again, thanks to Mike Kramer, thanks to Kay Landwehr, and thank you for your participation. Have a good day.